I'm gonna open in a very quick prayer, and then I'll do a recap of what we talked about last week. Then we'll jump into today. So please pray with me. Lord, we come before you and ask that you would be present here, that you would speak into our hearts and our minds, that you would enliven your word to us this evening, Lord. We ask this in your name. Amen. All right, so last week, the last 2 weeks, we looked at Genesis. We did the entirety of Genesis in 2 weeks. It's pretty cool. So the first week, we did the first 12 chapters. And last week, we did the first 11 chapters we did the first week. So last week, we did chapter 12 through 50, which is pretty cool. So, but if you break that down, if you just go back and you look at what is Genesis, you can say that Genesis is the creation narrative followed by the fall, and this is Adam and Eve, and then the effects of the fall, where they keep falling down, and then you move into 4 individuals: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And that's basically the entirety of Genesis, is creation, fall, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so now we're going to be moving into, we're going to do 2 books tonight. And I know that sounds impossible, but we're going to do the entirety of 2 books tonight. We're going to do Exodus and Leviticus. And before I jump into this, I want you to know that, this is a really good example of why I tell people, do not, people come to me and they say, I want to read my Bible. And I want to start at the beginning and I want to go all the way through. And I say, don't do that. And they look at me like I'm crazy. Today is a really good example why you don't do that. It's because Leviticus is the 3rd book of the Bible. And eventually you're going to hit Leviticus. And you're not going to make it through. Because it's boring and dry as can be. And most of it does not apply to 21st century people. So you will eventually hit Leviticus. This is why I tell you to bounce around from the Old Testament to the New Testament. If you want a reading guide, I've put one together. I can share it with you. Just talk to me later on. These 2 books, probably you have the most boring Old Testament book there is in Leviticus, and maybe the most exciting Old Testament book in Exodus. And you've got them in one evening tonight. So we're going to move into Exodus, and then we're going to go straight into Leviticus. And if you're a big fan of Leviticus, you probably do taxes for a living or something. I don't know. I got taxes on my mind because I'm trying to do my taxes. All right, so we're moving into... Ray, help me. What did I do?
It decided not to work. Here's the jack coming up. Okay.
Turn it over.
Show us your stuff, Ray. We'll try.
That's really weird. Oh, there we go. Let's go. Yay.
Okay, you want to...
Oh, it's awesome. Yay, Ray. Yay. All right. I was really sweating that one out. It's not a touch screen. All right, I will eventually get this up. Well, okay, so I need to bring up the other slideshow. The one that's up is old.
Not on the common.
No, that's last week's.
Yeah. So which one you want to bring up? Holy Apostles
Right there, Torah.
or? That's where we're at, wasn't it?
There's an updated version. Did it update?
Made no changes. Up in the corner?
Oh yeah, it's on 80 slides. Yeah, I got it.
You got it?
Yep. It's on 80 slides. All right. We got it now. Thank you, Ray. All right. All right. Now if I go over, it's not my fault. Isn't that how it works? All right. Okay, so the first book that we're going to be looking at is the book of Exodus. And actually, you can do Exodus and Leviticus pretty easily because they kind of divide out pretty nicely. The book of beginnings, it's much like Genesis, because in Genesis what you have is you have the beginning of creation. But in Exodus you have the beginning of the Israelites. And so in many ways it's functioning the same way as Genesis. It's the beginning. Everything is starting with Exodus. And so it's a pretty interesting book in that regard, in that what you have is Israel's departure from Egypt and Israel's new kind of standing or position with God. So it's a beginning for them. So it's going to mirror, in some sense, it's going to mirror Genesis in the fact that it's a beginning. So if you were to divide out Exodus, it divides out into three groups. So you've got the Israelites in Egypt. You remember how they got into Egypt? Okay, so Genesis is going to end telling you the story of Joseph. Part of the function of the story of Joseph is to get the Israelites into Egypt so that you know why they're there. So the Israelites in Egypt. Then the second part is them just kind of in the desert. And then the third part is the Mount Sinai part. That's the part that most people are familiar with. But Exodus is really kind of exciting because you're following their journey out of Egypt all the way to Mount Sinai. And because of that, it's pretty cool. So we're going to look at them in Egypt first. And there's a couple things that are important about this. The book opens with the descendants of Abraham in Egypt, where Genesis left off. We've already shared that. But it's 100 years later. And over the 100 years, they've grown in number. And so, when you have a group of people that are not native to a land, and all of a sudden they keep on growing, it gave the Egyptians concern. So what they end up doing is they end up enslaving them. And so the Israelites end up in Egyptian bondage. And this is where you kind of know the story with who's gonna pop up. Moses is going to pop up. So this is where Moses enters into. A lot of people think that Moses is in the book of Genesis. He's not. He doesn't show up until Exodus. So you're going to have the introduction of Moses into the story. So until now, it's just been patriarchs. It's been Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. It's kind of a side story, not a patriarch, but still an interesting story. But now you're getting into Moses and the Israelites as a group, and this is where the story changes quite a bit. So you've got the birth of Moses. You're all familiar with that, with the little basket, put baby in the basket. Yeah, you're all familiar with that. So we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the birth of Moses, but some things are interesting, and one of the things interesting is that he did get a fantastic education. He did learn the customs of how things work and all that. And so as a young man, he's struggling with the treatment of his people. He's actually going to try to free his people, and he's going to fail. And what do a lot of people do when they fail? They just run away. So Moses tries to free the Israelites. He can't, so he's just, okay, I'm out of here. And so he leaves. And so he's gonna leave, unable to free his people. But one of the things that's repeated in this narrative is God did not forget his people. God did not forget his people. Over and over again in the book of Exodus, you've got this idea of God did not forget his people. So Moses tries to free them, is unsuccessful, and then Moses runs away. So essentially, what is Moses doing? Yeah, to some degree.
He wasn't running away from God then. They didn't know God.
I mean, primarily, he's running away from the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Because he tried to free them. He failed. But another thing that he's doing is he's separating himself from the people that are enslaved. It enables him to forget about the people that he tried to rescue. If the people are right in front of you, you can't forget about it. They're right in your face. But Moses is going to separate himself. He's going to run away. And the reoccurring theme is maybe other people forgot about them, but God didn't forget about them. God is particularly interested in coming to the aid of his people, and he's going to do that by getting Moses. I've already gone over all that. And so you're also going to have a new covenant that's going to pop up here. Again, we've been tracking through the covenants in the Old Testament, so now you're going to be moving to from the covenant of Abraham, you're going to be moving to covenant with the Israelites. So you've got this burning bush moment. You're familiar with this? You all know this. This is Moses where he has his call. This is his call to free the Israelites. And do you remember what Moses says when he gets the call? I don't speak so well. I think you should send somebody else. And so, he's trying to get out of it. I don't want to do this. Please send somebody else. And maybe you've had a call in your life where please send somebody else. But God doesn't. God insists on sending Moses. So there's the famous call. There's the burning bush. There's Moses. And so Moses is going to become the deliverer of the Israelites. And so Moses is going to go back. He's going to try and get the Israelites free. But you all know that when a certain group of people have another group captive, they're not particularly keen on letting them go, are they? Especially when some guy comes up and says, hey, I think you should let them go. And they're like, I don't really care what you think. And so they don't just say, oh, well, it's you, Moses. Of course, we'll let the people go. Instead, they put up a little bit of fight, right? And then God responds in a variety of ways. But one of the ways that God responds is with the 10 plagues. And I put them all up there. You've got the water turned into blood, the infestation of frogs, the gnats, the flies, the livestock, the boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn. So you got all the plagues that they're going to have to go through. And this is God working through Moses to bring these about in order to get his people out of Egyptian bondage. So this is all about God saying, I've called these people, these are my people, I am their God, and they are my people, and I have come to deliver them. So, going to go through all the plagues. And the Egyptians essentially are rolling all their chips on Pharaoh being the one who's in control of things, because they do regard their kind of like kings or rulers in a manner that you and I regard gods. Whatever God we worship. So if we're Christians, or if we're Hindus, or if we're Muslims, they regarded their kings in that way. So what the real kind of battle here is the Egyptian Pharaoh and the God of the Israelites, and who's actually going to win that battle. That's what you're seeing in Exodus. And then you know the last plague is the death of the firstborn. Yeah. There's an event that's going to come with that plague, which is the Passover. You familiar with this? Okay, where you take the blood and you put it on the doorpost, and when the Spirit comes for the death of the firstborn, passes over every house that has the blood on the door. Yeah? So they do all that, which they're directed to do. It's a sign, and it's going to be like a continued practice. It's continued today, so that they don't forget about God's act of freeing them. In much the same way that you and I do Easter. It's kind of has a very similar place. In fact, like Passover is one of the main days for the Jewish people today. In just kind of like Easter, these are moments along the church calendar, or just a regular calendar, that call us to remember God's acts in history, so that we remember a faithful God. So you have Christmas, you've got Easter, you've got Pentecost, you've got all these events, and the same thing for, the Israelites. So you've got the Passover event, and then from there, what you're going to have is them actually going through the Red Sea. And that Red Sea event is going to place them in the desert. And this is where you move in to really the second part of Exodus. So the first part is all about them in Egypt, just what's taking place in Egypt. And it has a lot to do with God calling a certain group of people to be his people, and God intervening in history to make it so that God's people are free. Does that make sense? So you walk through all that, and then you're going to get into what I think is a really fun part of Exodus, because you begin to see the humanity of the Israelites. So let's just say, have you ever met somebody who said, I would believe if I saw a miracle? You've met people that say that? Yeah? You've never met anybody who said, I would believe if I saw a miracle right in front of me, I'd believe. But I don't believe because I don't believe in miracles. That's a fairly common kind of thing for people to say. The Israelites just walked through the Red Sea. It parted. They walked through it. They got to the other side. And when the Egyptians are coming through, the sea closes in on them. Like, if you saw that, would that be a life-changing moment for you? Let's not even argue if it actually happened or not. Just put that. Let's just say that it did happen 100% and you were there. Would it change your life? It didn't change theirs. And I don't think it would change yours either. Because our minds forget so quickly. We lose sight of the God that is there. And many of you have seen miracles in your life. You've seen things take place. And you're like, well, if I could just see one more, it would be really, really helpful. I want to show you what happens with the Israelites in the desert. And you're going to see that they forget about the God that delivered them from Egypt. Over and over and over. In fact, the rest of the Old Testament, the entirety of the Old Testament from here on out is about God reminding the Israelites that He is a faithful, loving God returned to me. Over and over and over again. Even though they continually see these things taking place in their life, they forget, they lose sight of it. It just goes away. And so what's astounding about them is how quickly it goes away. That's where I have a hard time. So they've just walked through the Red Sea. They get into the desert. And the desert part, chapters 12 through 18, is basically them going in circles and along the way questioning God, complaining and disbelief. I don't believe there's a God out there. Why did the God send us here? There's nothing to eat. There's nothing to do. We're just walking in circles and questioning whether God has put them on the right course or not. Over and over and over again. And they have just walked through the Red Sea. It just happened. And they immediately go into the desert. And this is what is that? That's 6 chapters, 7, however many. I'm not good at math. However many chapters. That is what those chapters are about, is just questioning God, complaining, and disbelief over and over and over again. And so, I forget what that was a picture of. I think it's a picture of them. Yeah, this is a long line of people. So, how could this be? Did they not understand what God did for them? Had they just witnessed probably one of the greatest miracles in the entire Bible? Like, I think it's astounding. Like, if the sea actually, they just witnessed this. And part of it is that you see this over and over. It's part of the human condition, is that we lose sight of God. We forget about God over and over. This is why we tell people to come to church all the time, because what church is supposed to do, doesn't always do this, but it's supposed to fill you up. And then I've shared this many times in sermons, then you're supposed to go out and you're supposed to leak everywhere. And then you're supposed to come back and get filled back up again. And then we send you out those red doors and you leak all over the place. It's the gospel. And then you come, and it's just a process that keeps on happening. But when you don't come back and get filled up, then you don't have anything left because you leaked. And it's what we see all the time, is that people have a tendency to run on E. They just run themselves all the way down on E to where they have nothing left. And this is when doubt, and this is when fear, and this is when question, this is when all these things start creeping in, because we're not continually maintaining our spiritual life. So this is a part of what they're going to be wrestling with. It's what they're struggling with. And so that is basically that middle section of Exodus. It is all just about them complaining, questioning, and disbelief. So if you ever kind of feel bad about yourself, you can read these chapters, and they'll probably make you feel a little bit better. Or you'll at least feel like you have company. You're not alone. So if we move on from there, though, you're going to get into the last part. The last part is the biggest part of Exodus. This is the Israelites at Mount Sinai. So this is 19 through 40. So this is basically 21 chapters you're looking at. So they're going to arrive at Mount Sinai. You know what happens at Mount Sinai, right? Ten Commandments. So we're going to talk about that a little bit because we kind of misunderstand the Ten Commandments a little bit. So we're going to break that down a little bit. But essentially what you have is just as with Abraham, God used a covenant. You're going to see a covenant being formed with the Israelites. And it's going to take place here. So instead of a person, which it went through the patriarchs. It went from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. God was working through individual people. So instead of an individual person, you're going to see God making a covenant with a nation. And this is the covenant that God's going to make with the Israelites. And it's going to happen at Mount Sinai. And the Ten Commandments are all part of that covenant. These are the things that God wants us to do or to not do. So you've got the Sinai covenant with the Ten Commandments as kind of like the anchor, the main thrust of the covenant. Now, we kind of misunderstand the Ten Commandments. Biblically, they're actually called words rather than laws. And so we have taken them to be the laws of God. And the Ten Commandments are better understood as the Word of God to His people. Because what the Ten Commandments are meant to do is to change your heart and not just your actions. You can change actions without changing your heart. You can change the things that you do outwardly, but you can still want to do them. The Ten Commandments were actually meant to reveal to God's people what God wanted them to do and to not do, and for that to be the thing that they did not want to do and the thing that they wanted to do. It was meant to change their hearts so that we love the things of God rather than we follow the laws that we don't want to follow. Because that's kind of what Christianity is kind of morphed into, hasn't it? It's morphed into this, I don't really like this, but I have to do this, and I'm not allowed to do this. And so we'll say things like, well, if I wasn't a Christian, I would definitely go with you. But I am, so I have to stay home. And so what we're revealing is, I really want to. This Christianity thing, this hasn't changed my heart at all. I desperately want to be with you. But because I am a Christian, I have to be boring and stay home. And so it's meant to actually kind of change your heart. So when you understand it not as laws, but God's words to His people, it means that what God is doing is He's sharing His heart for His people. And that should change our hearts, rather than it being laws. Do this, or don't do this. It's just it's a better way of understanding it. But we've turned it into Ten Commandments and all that kind of stuff. But either way, it's a call to change. I've already shared all that. The one thing I didn't say is because when they made a covenant with God, they are making a covenant that says you are a new people. You are a new. You have been made anew. If you remember, like you go back to the covenants, oftentimes people get a name change. And we talked about this before. And the name change is symbolic of you are a new creation. We saw this with Saul, who became Paul. We saw it with Simon, who became Peter. We saw it with Abram, who became Abraham. You see it over and over again because what God is communicating is when you enter into that covenant, you are made anew. And so the Israelites are a new people. A new people in covenant with God, although they don't act like it in the majority of the Bible. But that's what they are. And the truth is that you and I wouldn't either. None of us would. This is part of the human condition. And so you move on from there, you get these chapters list specific cases in which the principles of the covenant are to be applied to life. So yeah, it's going through and it's giving you examples of what this means. What does it mean to honor your mother and your father? Well, these chapters are going to, it's not just going to say honor your mother and father, it's going to say honor your mother and father, and here's what that looks like. It's going to say love your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and here is what that looks like. It's going to say don't have any idols, and here's what that looks like. So it's taking the law of God and it's putting some flesh on it and saying this is what that looks like in your life. So it's more than just don't do this. It's don't do this, and if you're not doing this, this is what your life will look like. So it's unpacking the law that God gives His people. Does that make sense? So it's they're really cool chapters. That's chapters 21 through 23. And then you come down to 24 through 24, 3 through 8. Moses in a solemn and sacred covenant ceremony. This is where the covenant actually kind of takes place, where they seal the covenant. And then you move on from there and you get to the tabernacle. Now the tabernacle is super important. And the tabernacle, the purpose of the tabernacle is because, two things I want to say about it. First of all, it's mobile. And that's because the Israelites are traveling around. They don't have the promised land yet. They don't have a land. And so they're traveling. They're moving around. It would be like somebody who lives in like an RV. And so that they live in their RV, they travel around in their RV, and it has wheels so that they can go from one place to another because they don't have a stationary location. Well, you can't build a temple. If they built a temple at Mount Sinai, then they're going to leave in like 2 years. And then what are they going to do with the temple and all the money and all the energy? So God says, build me a tabernacle. And what a tabernacle is essentially portable temple. And it's a structure that they set up. And then when they move to a new location, they break it down, they pack it up, and they carry it with them. Then when they set up to a new location, they set up the tabernacle. Now, the purpose of the tabernacle is it's where God dwells among His people. So it's really, really important because they don't have the Holy Spirit yet. They don't have Jesus. Because right now we have Jesus who through the power of the Holy Spirit dwells in our hearts and can dwell in my heart as well as with my wife who is like 11 miles away from here. They have God who is contained. And so God is going to dwell among His people, but He needs a place to dwell among His people. And so they build this tabernacle where God dwells among His people. And so this is super important for them. Because it's a grand spectacle of God dwelling among His people. I think I have a picture of it, which is not an accurate picture, obviously. It was not taken on an iPhone. But this is the idea. This is the idea that this light that you see is something of what they saw in God dwelling among His people. And we know that they could recognize it because when God leaves, you remember from their disobedience, God withdraws His presence. This is much later on in the Old Testament, but they know that He left. There's something that's not there. And so you have this idea, but this is kind of what the tabernacle looked like, kind of like a tent structure with a big perimeter around it. And if you remember when I preached a couple of weeks ago on Jesus clearing out the money changers, and I said that the money changers were not in the sanctuary, but they were on temple grounds. They were like here. They were inside the tent area, but they weren't in like the actual sanctuary. So when Jesus drives them out, he's driving them basically off of the property of the temple. Now this is a tabernacle, but it kind of has the same structure as the temple. So this is where God dwells among his people. And this is where this begins, Mount Sinai. And they're going to carry this all the way through till they get to the promised land. And then when they get to their own land, God's going to say, build me a temple. A fixed structure where God will reside among his people. So this is the tabernacle. You get to the tabernacle chapters are 25 through, basically the end of the book. So you've got instructions, and this is where it gets really boring. So it's kind of like it's prepping you for Leviticus. It's like Leviticus is right around the corner, guys. And I just want you to know that you're going to have to deal with a whole bunch of laws and rules that probably you don't care about at all. So let's just start with it right now. And so you've got the instructions for building the tabernacle. So if you struggle with insomnia, you can turn to the end of Exodus or Leviticus, and that will cure you. If it doesn't, you got a real problem. So this is the instructions for the building. This is the obedience. Another large section telling Moses to follow every single law, every detail. Don't skip out on details. And you see this is a biblical principle that you see over and over again in the Bible, where God gives very specific directions and then says, do not take shortcuts. Do not omit things. Do everything to the T that I've told you to do. And the Israelites have a long history of not following that. And they just say, he didn't really mean that. We could just round the corner. And then they pay the price for that over and over again. So instructions for building it, and then God basically saying, I'm serious. This is exactly how I want it built. But in the middle, we're reminded of the sinfulness, because as they're building this thing, you have the golden calf. Okay, you remember that? Moses goes up the mountain. And they say, we don't want to go with you because we're afraid of God. So you go. And so Moses goes up the mountain and he meets with God. But they think that he's going to come like right back down. Like if I said, hold on a second, I got to go do something. And I left and I went outside and I didn't come back for 2 weeks. And y'all just sitting here like, is he coming back? We should have made more soup. So Moses doesn't come back for a long time. And because he doesn't come back, they say to themselves, well, we're not sure he's ever coming back. And so they ask, I think it's Aaron, can't remember exactly. They ask Aaron, they say, hey, look, you got to make us a god, because Moses went up to talk to God and he never came back. So you have to make us a god. This is what Moses makes, or this is what Aaron makes. Moses comes back down. You remember what he does when he comes back down the mountain? He breaks the tablets. He's so angry, he breaks the tablets. This is something that I would do. I do this stupid stuff all the time. I will come down the mountain, I'll break the tablets. I won't think about anything because my kids did something ridiculous. And then as soon as I look at the tablets broken, I'll realize I've got to go back up the mountain and get new tablets. And that's what he does. He goes back up the mountain and he gets new tablets. But that's this story taking place. So you're seeing the sinfulness of the Israelites. They went through the Red Sea, and they're still doing all this. And so you have all that, and then I think we're getting pretty much to the end. So Moses and the Israelites, they finished building the tabernacle as the Lord instructed them. Very important. When it was completed, God's glory filled the tabernacle. So when it's completed, God's glory fills the tabernacle, and God's presence now rests among his people. And this is a biblical theme of God dwelling among his people. And God continually saying, if you keep doing this stuff that you're doing, if you keep disobeying me, I'm no longer going to dwell among my people. I'm going to withdraw my presence from my people. And the Israelites saying, we're God's people. He'll never do that. And then eventually he does it. So that's kind of the climax of Exodus. Now, a couple theological points is the idea of deliverance, which I've already shared with you. This is God determined to deliver his people from Egyptian bondage. He's going to raise up somebody who wants nothing to do with it. Then he's going to give them the power to do it. Then he's going to march them through the Red Sea. And then God's going to deal with these stubborn, ungrateful people for year after year after year because he loves them, because he cares for them. So the idea of deliverance is very strong in the book of Exodus. The idea of covenant is very strong throughout the entirety of the Bible, but particularly in Exodus, because you're seeing it go from a covenant with individuals to a covenant with a nation. So that, and we still have that idea today that the Israelites are God's chosen people. And so this is something that we can understand because it's a part of our culture. And then you have the presence of God, that God dwells among his people, that God's not absent, that God didn't create the world, set everything in motion and say, I hope they figure it out, and just walk away. So we're not deists. We don't believe that God just set things in motion and doesn't interact with the world around us. We believe that not only does God interact with the world, but he dwells among his people. Now, it's different for you and I. Can't say for certain, but I'm pretty sure that you all don't have tabernacles in your backyard because God dwells in our hearts rather than in an actual building or structure. Even that building over there, nobody's in there right now. It's just a building. It was a sanctuary when we were in there doing evening prayer. It will be a sanctuary on Sunday, and it will be a sanctuary when people are in there. But right now, it's a pretty cool building, and that's all that it is. Actually, this is more of a sanctuary right now. We've moved the sanctuary. So that's the theological significance. Move right into the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is super easy to go through, so I'm actually going to make it through today. That's pretty cool. All right, so Leviticus is a completely neglected book, and I would say probably for reasonable reasons. So you've got, it's neglected for a couple of reasons. One is it's putting forward a sacrificial worship system that's way too far removed from anything that we know in the 21st century. And then the second reason is that it does appear to be an interruption in the flow of history. So you had Genesis, which has, creation, fall, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then it moves you right into the Exodus. And then you're going to get into Numbers and Deuteronomy, which is going to pick up more history. But in the middle of that, you just have this book of Leviticus, which is a bunch of laws and rules. So it kind of takes away the history part that we were walking through. We're like, okay, we're walking through history, and then all of a sudden it's just like chapter after chapter of laws. So for those two reasons, it's kind of neglected. It does play a really important part in the canon because what it shares with us is that we worship a holy God and that he expects us to in turn to be holy. He expects us to look like him, to value the things that he values. So we'll see some of that as we go through this. I think there's basically four divisions. Yeah, 4 divisions in Exodus. I'll just put them all up right here. You have right forms of worship is the first one, acceptable sacrifices. what kind of sacrifices does God want? And you'll be stunned when you hear all the crazy sacrifices. So that's the first part. It's a whole 7 chapters just dedicated to what kinds of sacrifices God wants. The second one is the conditions for a priest. Another, 3 chapters on what God demands for somebody to be a priest. The third chapter is an acceptable state of God's worshipers, what God demands for his people, but not what you think, like things that don't apply to us anymore. So I'll get to that eventually. And then 4, you have the holiness code, which is kind of like the most important part of Leviticus. So let's look at this.
By priesthood there, don't you mean like being a rabbi or something? I mean, these are books that were written by the Jewish people. They don't have priests, they have rabbis.
They're priests.
They do?
Yeah. They have the great high priest.
Rabbis are just teachers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you have rabbis and priests.
Okay.
So a priest is one that offers sacrifices. So that's the big debate of why Episcopalians are called priests as opposed to pastors. So priest carries with it the title of the one that is overseeing sacrifices. But they, even during Jesus' time, you have the great high priest, you've got rabbis, you've got the scribes. So you've got layers.
Okay, so the Jewish priesthood consists of a bunch of layers, like we have bishops and priests. And
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Deacons.
So, but we'll get to that chapter because it's really important. So the first 7 chapters are just about the different sacrifices that you can offer. So you can offer burnt sacrifices, which is generally like animals. You can offer grain sacrifices, and then you offer sacrifices for peace, sacrifices for sin, sacrifices for guilt, and there's generally 5 different kinds of sacrifices that are addressed in the Old Testament, and they're all kind of laid out in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. So it's a tough 7 chapters. I don't highly recommend you starting with Leviticus. But that's the first 7 chapters, just going through all the different sacrifices. If you move on from there, then you're going to get to the priest, to the 8 through 10, which is the ordination and installation of priests, and that demonstrates the consequences for inappropriate priestly activity. I do think that in the church today, priests should read Leviticus chapters 8 through 10, a little bit more than they do. You have did you know? I can't even talk about this. Did you know that in the Lutheran and Methodist Church, they have, and you can look this up, they have a thing called the Sparkle Creed, which takes the place of the Nicene Creed and Apostles' Creed.
When did this?
I'm going to let you look that up. You can use your imagination now.
Sparkle. We never heard of that.
If you ever say the Sparkle Creed, lightning should shoot down from heaven. I'm not even going to go into it. You look it up. Tom's looking it up right now. He's about to sparkle. All right. Chapters 8 through 10, dealing with the consequences and actions of clergy that do ridiculous things. And so it's just laying all that out. If you're a priest, you do this. If you're a priest, you can't do this. It's just all the rules for the priest. And it's always been a higher standard for clergy rather than laity. It's always been that way. And it's just by necessity. It should be that way. And so you have that. Then you get into chapters 11 through 16, which is going to deal with the actions of people. So, but it's dealing with things that you and I don't have to deal with because Peter had a vision. You remember Peter's vision in Acts? Peter has this vision where the Macedonians say, come here. And Peter's like, well, I can't go there because you're Gentiles. And God comes before him and says, what I've made clean, do not make unclean. Because, I'm messing up two visions here. Messing up Paul's and Peter's. So, what's that?
Things you can eat.
Yeah. And God says, arise, kill, and eat. And Peter says, I would never eat that which is unclean. And God says, what I have made clean, do not call unclean. This is the moment that most of these laws that we're talking about today have fallen out. So when people say Christians only enforce certain rules that they like because you weren't allowed, if you're a Christian, you're not allowed to eat bacon because that's from a pig. You can tell them that Peter's vision threw that out, and that's an Old Testament law that does not apply into the New Testament. Most of these. So for example, the food, they're all the purity laws. The food purity laws, those no longer apply to us. You can eat shellfish, you can eat pork, you can eat, if we couldn't eat pork, I'm pretty sure I would be something else. So you can eat all the foods. As far as childbirth, you're not considered unclean from giving childbirth. As far as skin diseases, you're not, if you had any of these things, you were not allowed to be in the presence of God for a period of time. All that's kind of done away with. If any sort of bodily discharge, you were considered ritually unclean. You were considered ritually unclean if I had some sort of disease and Sue walked across my shadow. She would be considered unclean and would have to go through a ritual ceremony to become clean again. All that stuff is gone. Okay? You can read Leviticus for fun just to see all the crazy purity laws that were in place that are no longer in place. The moral law is still in place. So the purity laws have gone away, but the moral law still stands. And that's the main distinction that you can make. Purity law's gone, moral law still very much in place. Anybody look up Sparkle Creed? How do you like that?
Rainbow.
It's wild. It's totally wild. I almost passed out.
Two dads. Come on.
Were the purity laws put in place just to put them in place, or were they healthy, helpful reasons behind them to avoid communicable diseases?
I would not be able to answer that.
Okay, and the other question is, that's the first time you use Yahweh. Is that where it's used first?
Yahweh is going to be used, pretty much starting in from the Israelites being a nation and called out of Egypt. You're going to see that they're going to refer to God as Yahweh.
Don't the Jews still believe in kosher? I mean,
They do. We don't, because they don't believe in the New Testament. So Peter's vision means absolutely nothing to them. So the Jewish people still have these laws. Now, maybe not all of them, but they should have these laws in place. Whereas for Christians, Acts is going to undo
Right.
the purity
But
laws.
we're talking about the books of the Torah. here.
Yes.
So we're talking about.
These people still do. But, I'm just talking about if you're reading Leviticus from a 21st century standpoint, these laws that you're reading in Leviticus, they do not apply for the most part because they're the purity laws. But they did very much apply, and they still apply for the Jewish people.
So did they mention Nathan's hot dogs in there? 'Cause they're still pretty good.
It's a shame some of the things they can't eat,
Hebrew Nat?
Yeah.
If I was a educated Jew and I picked up the Torah, an old Torah, the words of the Torah would be the same as what is in our Episcopal Bible.
For the most part, obviously you're going to have translation issues. And I told you at the beginning of this, I'm going to try and slide Jesus in here as much as possible. So it's a different way that you're reading it. Because you're reading and understanding it different, you're going to translate it different as well. So you will see that there are differences, but for the most part, they're the same. So you got all that, and then you move on to the last part of Leviticus. And the last part of Leviticus is the holiness code. And the reason that they refer to it as the holiness code is holiness is going to show up 85 times in these chapters. So the focus is on the holiness of God, which then goes down to focus on the holiness of God's people. Because God is holy, His people need to be holy. And that's kind of the purpose of the last kind of sections. This is going to deal with the moral law, which is still in place for Christians. So it's going to deal with sexual purity. It's going to deal with observance of sacred holidays. It's going to deal with fair treatment of the poor. Those are the three main things. It deals with other things, but those are the main focus of the holiness code is on sexual purity, observing holy days, and the correct treatment of the poor. And you can see that these are universal issues that we have had throughout history. Nothing new today. What is being addressed in Leviticus is the same thing that needs to be addressed today. And if it was done in the medieval church, it would be the same thing. And if it was in the Reformation church, same thing. We're not good with sex, we're not good at taking care of the poor, and we're not good at observing the things we're supposed to observe. That's pretty normal. So moving on from there, the holiness code, theological significance is on the law in Leviticus, it's on sacrifices in Leviticus, and it's on holiness. That is kind of the focus of Leviticus. Next week, we're going to move into Numbers, Deuteronomy, and that is the last week. And I got to say, 2 books in one evening is pretty impressive, y'all. It's pretty impressive. All right. You are free to go. You're what? Yeah. I just stand there until people clap.